I wish I could move around and talk, but I can't at this point. I'm afraid of getting off in a rabbit trail. But the Lord has really helped me to trace back a lot of the roots of my behaviors, and so I kind of try to touch base on every season of my life. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. I was born in March of 1988, a month premature. In the hospital, one of the nurses failed to put one of my many IVs in the vein properly. This would completely destroy the muscle tissue in my left foot. And this had a big role in my developing self-confidence. As I grew, the scars shrunk, and it twisted and contorted my toes to the point where they didn't touch the ground. Many doctor's appointments and physical therapy are the bulk of my childhood memories. Other than that, I played and laughed as every other child did. I had wonderful parents, everything I needed, and a lot that I didn't. I was taught proper morals and values, and how I was raised was never the reason I acted out later in life. Around the age of 5, my mother came into my room and told me we need to have a talk. She informed me that my dad, the man who had been raising me, was my father, but not biologically. There was another man, and his name was Tony, and he was on the phone. I would put my daughter in this exact position later in life. You see, nothing would change, just a few extra presents under the Christmas tree and the occasional call. As I got a little older, this began to really take effect on me. This man claimed to be my father, but still I had yet to meet him. Why wouldn't my biological father, and I use this term out of respect for the man who raised me and who is my father, why wouldn't he come for a visit? I began to think it was my fault. I was a small child, and I did not understand the circumstances and how far away he really was. I just blamed myself. This thought would snowball into severe depression at a young age. I had even went to school informing my teachers that I was contemplating suicide, and that's not normal behavior. My parents shrugged it off at the time, assuming that I had heard it from some sort of movie or a video game, but they never knew how I felt because I refused to talk about it. My parents used to joke and say you can't even pay Brandon to talk, but honestly, I just didn't understand anything at this age. When we moved out of St. Mary's to Fort Myers, Florida, I love Florida, beautiful beaches and no snow. I was too young to realize how bad our neighborhood really was, and I could spend the next half hour telling you crazy stories about it, but we don't have that much time. I'm only describing this time to tell you that I was finally in the same state as my biological father, and I had my heart set on finally meeting him. And when it never happened, resentment began to form. We were only in Florida for a short time, 4 years to be exact. When my mother became pregnant with my little brother, that was when the decision was made to send me back to Ohio. After his birth, they would join me. I was upset about this, and I didn't understand why. I was the only one that had to move, but after a while I got over it. I really missed my grandparents, and especially my cousin Richard. Me and him were similar in age, about 6 months apart. I thank God for this time tremendously. Wapak was different than Florida. In Wapak I had free reign to ride my bike wherever I wanted to go. In Florida I wasn't allowed to even leave our yard. My depression was still there, but my anger and resentment took over. I told my biological father some choice words, and we didn't speak again for 4 years. I had been back in Ohio for a few years before I made any close friends. I was always the loner type, and I never really connected with other kids. Richard was the only friend I really had. We were inseparable every other weekend while he was in town for visitation with his dad. I finally did look up to a group of kids, and they wore heavy metal t-shirts, they smoked cigarettes, and were all on probation at a young age. Richard and I began to drift apart. I began to drink and experimenting with pot while he played sports. When I was 15, on December 16th, I was woken up in the middle of the night on a school night. There had been a fatal car accident, and Richard and a classmate were both killed. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Matthew 5:4. We spent the night at the hospital, and I immediately began to disconnect from the world around me and retreat further within myself. This was not my first experience with grief. A few months earlier, a friend of mine had committed suicide. After this, I would have several more friends pass before I would finish school, but Richard's death had lasting effects. A couple of days later, my grandfather and I went to claim Richard's car from the wreckage yard, and the sight of that car would haunt my dreams for years to come. The funeral was a closed casket, but I was allowed one final look at him. All I can remember thinking is, that's not even him. He was beyond the point of recognition, and I would not accept it. In the hours following the funeral services, I would be the proud recipient of my first underage consumption, and I immediately began to binge drink. All my focus and friendships now revolved solely on my substance abuse. How was I going to get beer before the weekend, and who could I buy pot from after school? And I chased every single high I could find. Junior year, I finally met the man on the phone and his wife. After Richard's death, we began talking again, and on occasion, but a funeral of their own had brought them to Ohio. By this time, I had become good at hiding behind the mask that I created. I also moved out at this time. My rebellious spirit took over, and I decided I knew better than my parents. They had developed their own substance abuse, and in my mind, they had no right to pass judgment on me and what I was doing. I was 17 with an apartment, so I always had the party house. School nights, work, it made no difference. I began experimenting with cocaine, hallucinogens like LSD, mushrooms, and ecstasy. My senior year, I wasn't able to keep it together so easily. I had received 3 underage consumptions in 9 months, which honestly was a real blessing. Without the third, I never would have even graduated. I had skipped so many of my classes, most of my teachers just assumed I had my schedule changed. I spent the majority of my senior year in jail. I was permitted to walk what they referred to as the Green Mile, and that's the small yard between Auglaize County Jail and the Opportunity School. I was on juvenile and adult probation at the same time. In jail, I was able to get my grades up enough to receive a diploma, and I was released on graduation day. I remained what I proudly referred to as a weekend warrior for the next 6 to 7 years. I finally got off probation after my 21st birthday, but by 22 I had a felony for drug trafficking. More intense probation wouldn't stop my use. I became a barfly. I lost jobs, relationships. Nothing seemed to faze me, and I stayed in this state for years. Reality is, I had become completely disconnected from the world around me. I had no relationship with any family member, and I had completely left my little brother to grow up alone. The only friends I had were the guys I partied with, and if you weren't at the bar on a Friday or Saturday night, I didn't even care to know you. I had been ordered to do a ton of different classes on substance abuse, but I never really participated. When I did, it was only lies that I carefully fabricated. I knew everything. I knew exactly what everyone wanted to hear. Even my probation officers were fooled. I quickly realized that paying off my fines, holding a job, and maintaining appointments kept me under the radar. It was a routine, and I was good at it. One half of Proverbs 12:15 says, "The way of the fool is right in his own eyes." At 24, I met a girl from work, and she didn't drink much or use drugs, so we had little in common. When it came to my depression at this time, I believed it was an all-time low. I worked alone in my own secluded area of a factory. I lived alone, and by the weekend, I was just starved for human interaction. So off to the bar I went. We broke up right away, but a few weeks later, I got the call that she was pregnant. This brought me great joy. For years, I wanted to settle down, and I just knew that a baby would do that. What I was really trying to convince myself is that a child would fill that God-sized void in my heart. She had seen all too well the direction I was heading and wanted no part of it. She immediately began to tell me that I would have nothing to do with this baby. She had every right to feel that way looking at it now, but I didn't see it that way. I had a lawyer before I had a daughter. I began drinking with a whole new purpose, no more trying to fool everyone into thinking I was okay inside. I wouldn't leave the bar until I couldn't walk home. I began running around with people on heavier drugs. At first it scared me watching them shoot up, but after a while, and the drunker I got, I realized that's what I wanted. Heroin seemed so sweet to me at first, but once it sunk its teeth into me, I woke up next to a monster, and it tore away every recognizable part of me. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. I had been advised by my peers that this drug had rules: never be high more than 3 days in a row. I did as they said, and I only used on the weekends for a long time. But it was every single weekend. The night my daughter was born, I was at work, and if it wasn't for a coworker, I never would have even known. I called the hospital and I begged the nurse for information. I just wanted to know if she was healthy or not. The nurse didn't tell me anything, but she did tell her mother that I called, and I was permitted to come to the hospital one time and hold her in my arms. I would leave the hospital and call my lawyer and begin the fight for visitation. It would take over 6 months before I would see her again, and during that void, my drug use got out of control. I wanted to be numb all the time. I couldn't cope with the situation that I had put myself in. It took over a year of everyday use for my family to realize what I was doing to myself. Now and again, the reality of what I was doing crept in, and this could be my last shot, and I could be found right here with a needle in my arm. But with heroin, death seemed bittersweet to me. I would just fall asleep and I would never have to feel anything again. Psalms 139 verse 8 says, "If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. And if I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there." I began to have my visits, and I would stop using days before so I wouldn't have to use while my daughter was there. Withdrawals became worse and worse, and before I knew it, every day began to run together, and that illusion of control faded away. My family decided to confront me about my use in a hope to save my life. They wanted me to go to rehab, but I had different plans. After hearing for years I should move to Tennessee, where my biological father now lived, get my life together and work for him landscaping. I had hit what I had thought was my bottom. I called and I lied about my drug use, and they bought me a Greyhound ticket. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Proverbs 18:12. I upped and left, watching my daughter as the bus pulled away and it tore me apart. Withdrawals started before I even reached the state of Tennessee. This would save my life for a time. I spent 6 months down there free from heroin, and was introduced to the Lord Jesus Christ and the gospel for the first time through Bible studies. I was eager to learn, but I was unable to commit. Romans 7:18 says, "For I know that nothing good lives in me, and that is my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out." I met a girl, but I was homesick. I missed my daughter, I missed my family, and I was miserable. So after 6 months, I decided to come home. She ultimately chose to come with me. She left her friends and her family, and I wish she never would have. Before we even reached Ohio, I was already searching for heroin back home. As soon as we touched down, I picked up right where I left off. I began using behind her back steadily. That's when I decided to lie to her. The fear of withdrawals fueled my decisions. She had confided in me that she was interested in trying a drug by the name of Molly. So I devised a plan to tell her that heroin was Molly. I had hopes that she would try it, throw up, and not care for it, and then I would be able to use guilt-free. My decision would ruin her life for a number of years. Although I didn't rush into showing her the extent of my addiction, she soon realized every time I used, I would lock myself in the bathroom. When she finally did discover my secret, I thought our relationship would end. But to my surprise, she was more upset by the fact that I was not including her in this new way to get high, and she had taken a dark turn, and I no longer had to hide what I had really become. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for the good of them who love God, to them that are called according to his purpose." Heroin quickly consumed what was left of my life. This time my family caught on way faster than the first. When they confronted me again, once again I ran. I sold everything I could. I packed my car and left, but not without a pit stop in Dayton. This time would ultimately save my life. I would never use heroin again. The withdrawals were worse than I had ever experienced. I had managed to stay high the entire time I was home. Now back in Tennessee, anger and resentment set in, and I didn't want to be there, and I had ruined everything again, and this is not where I belong. This girl had approached me one evening about a month after we moved in with her parents. She asked me to find heroin, and I told her I didn't know anyone there. Besides, everyone I ever met there was on meth. It only took about a New York minute for us to decide to try it. We had even had a syringe still hidden from Ohio. See, I didn't take steps creeping into meth addiction. I jumped head first. Her parents figured out right away, and our relationship quickly ended. I once again was forced to move into my biological father's house and work for him. I kept myself together long enough for me to move out and get a vehicle, and this would be my downfall. When left to my own devices, I destroyed myself, and I had had this pattern for many years at this point. But the Lord is not slack concerning his promises, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering towards usward, not willing that any of us should perish, but all of us should come to repentance. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Once they discovered I was using there, they quickly took steps to disrupt my use. I now see that some of this was out of love and concern. I had lost over 60 pounds, sleeping 4 to 6 hours a week and wearing size 26 jeans. Eating maybe once, and I was out of control. The decision was made to fire me and withhold my last paycheck, not wanting to fund my addiction. This and amongst the other things that were tried at this time would fill me with rage. And this would be the only time I ever lashed out in anger. I broke into their business. I stole a small television, a handgun, a purse, and a stack of blank payroll checks, and all the checks that were left out written to their company. I smashed the television in the woods. I ditched the purse. I traded the handgun for meth. I burnt the checks to their business to hurt their profits. I intended to sell the payroll checks to stay high, and this would land me a 2-year prison sentence. I was released after 7 months on what is referred to as a determinate release. Here it would be considered a judicial. But as a dog returns to its vomit, so does a fool return to his folly. Proverbs 26:11. I had returned to the exact position that led me there. This time I would become homeless, stealing food from local gas stations and convenience stores, panhandling, doing odd and end handyman jobs, couch surfing from various trap house to trap house, running around with various women caught up in human trafficking. At one point I broke into a shed for a place to come down. I had zero remorse for this decision. I was living in the moment, and in that moment I had a piece of foam to sleep on, an outlet to charge my Wi-Fi phone, and even managed to find some MRE military rations to eat. It didn't take long for me to violate parole at this rate. The thought of returning to prison scared me to death. I finally managed to scrape up enough money selling stolen property to pay my dealer to bring me back to Ohio. I was home for 5 days. In that time, every plan I put together seemed to fall apart at the seams. The night before being arrested, I broke into my grandmother's camper in Indian Lake. It was 10 below zero, just before Christmas in 2016. I was huddled in front of a space heater, and I realized I was at a crossroad in my life. The only plan I could come up with was to steal the ingredients, cook a batch of meth, sell it, and then run out west. I couldn't believe what I had done to my life. So much had become a blur, and this couldn't be who I really am. I hadn't seen my daughter in over 2 years, and I was tired and ashamed. I got on my hands and knees and I cried to the Lord. I haven't so much as even prayed in almost a year. I poured myself out. Lord, I don't know what I'm doing. I know what I'm about to do is wrong, but I have no choice. Does that prayer sound familiar? Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholdeth him with his right hand. Psalms 37:24. He replied just a few short hours later, not the way you might expect. No thunder, no lightning, no angel. Instead, it was the sheriff at the door. Deep down, I was relieved. I had a warm place to sleep, food to eat, and I never thought I would be so happy to be in jail. But I began to lean on him. I studied the Word, and I prayed every night. I I started attending Celebrate Recovery inside Always County Jail. 6 months later, after fighting extradition, trying to desperately procrastinate my ultimate fate, I finally gave up. The state of Tennessee was there to pick me up, and I was terrified. I ended up in prison outside of Memphis, Tennessee. During my time, I would see things I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I wouldn't take it back either. I learned to trust the Lord and hold true to the power of His might. He stuck true to His promise to never leave or forsake me. I went on to lead several Bible studies in my dorm. In God I have put my trust, and I will not be afraid of what man can do to me. Psalms 56:11. Since my release in January 2018, after completing several fatherhood programs, I was able to successfully reintegrate into my daughter's life, just in time to stop an adoption case that would prevent me from ever seeing her again. WOCAP took special interest in me, presenting me with a stepping stone award and finding the funds for me to become a CDCA. I took the first job that come along driving forklift, and I really struggled with my purpose for the first 7 months I was home. I attended the Greater Sydney Area Men's Emmaus Walk number 71, and I sat at the table of John. This truly brought my faith to life, and it's an experience I would recommend to anyone. I was truly able to lay my burdens down to the Lord for the first time. After my Emmaus weekend, I began to feel the Lord's tug on my heart, and I must make amends with my biological father for the harm that I had caused him and his family. This is step 8 and 9 of the 12 steps. This would reestablish communication with him. I would give my testimony here at this chapter of Brianna's Hope and feel led to start one in Always County. But I would put that on the back burner for a while and go on to manage the Victor House in St. Mary's for 14 months. If you're not familiar with the Victor House, it is a faith-based recovery home much like your House of Hope. I would later recruit the support of the Resource and Opportunity Center of St. Mary's to back up an Always County chapter of Brianna's Hope. Everything would fall into place, from the food to the t-shirts. God provided plenty of men and women who had the fire as much as I, and it's truly a blessing to know that you are right in the middle of what God is doing. Matthew 19:26 says, "But Jesus beheld them and said, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Before our first meeting ever took place, my biological father would ask me to fly to Tennessee to speak in their church. I would, afterward, be introduced to the beautiful woman I now call my wife. We would have a long-distance relationship for a while during my time at the Victor House, and we were married this past September. She knew me in active meth addiction, but wanted no part of me then.
No, he for real would walk around, and he has a bag of bones, and he walked around just thinking he was hot stuff, and he said, "Hey girl," and this, no, like for real, he's like maybe 80 pounds, soaking wet, for real. He just thought he was it.
Still think I'm it. I would really go on to worry about life after the Victor House. After such a spiritual high and seeing the Lord's hand on those men's lives, I would fear the spiritual crash and valley that was sure to come. But also in September, I took a job as the first recovery coach in Van Wert and Paulding County. Soon, a Christian radio program out of Chicago by the name of Unshackled will be airing a version of my story and my coming to Christ. I pray God will use this as a way to impact more men and women. Earlier this month, I served on my second Epiphany team. Epiphany is a prison ministry much like the Walk to Emmaus. It's truly amazing and humbling experience. I watched 22 men give their heart to Jesus, and even some of them converting from Islam. I can and will not take any of the credit for the turnaround in my life. The Bible clearly states in Romans 2:11, "For there is no respect of persons with God. What he has done for me, he will do for you Also in Romans 2, we find that it is the goodness of God that leads men to repentance. I do not stand here like a man on a mountaintop looking down. My path has been filled with ups and downs, trials, and a lot of failures. Although I do not struggle with hard drugs anymore, I do struggle with my sinful nature. This is a process and it is a progression, being conformed into the image of His Son. It is within the Bible I was shown my worth, my value, how to be a good husband and a father. This is where I find my hope and my strength. And I'm going to leave you with a few scriptures. Romans 1:20 says, "Since the earliest times men have seen the earth and sky and all God has made, and have been known the existence of a great eternal power, so they will have no excuse when they stand before God at judgment day." Ezekiel 36:26, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." In Revelations 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in, and I will dine with him, and him with me." And just know you are surrounded by loving and supporting people here tonight who will help you take that step if you are ready.
Yeah.